The three humans examined their assignments with curious expressions that the assembled alien academics couldn't quite interpret. Were they confused, intimidated, amused? The subtle nuances of Deathworlder facial expressions remained a challenge for even the most sophisticated xenobiologists. These are just basic calibration assessments. Professor Klaxis explained, his translator carefully modulating his natural harmonic speech patterns. Simple exercises to establish your current understanding of fundamental principles. Sophia flipped through the quantum physics problems, her eyebrows rising slightly. And how long do we have to complete these? The standard completion period is 1 galactic cycle, Administrator Xin7 replied. Approximately 14 of your Earth days. Marcus looked up from his dinobiology assignment. 2 weeks for homework? That's generous. The consortium academics exchanged confused glances. Generous. These problems represented the foundational knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of galactic scientific development. For species with properly evolved cognitive structures, 14 days provided barely enough time to contemplate the interdimensional implications alone. You may use any of the consortium's research facilities. Dr. Zilf's collective voice hummed through their translator. The botanical hive mind's individual components swayed gently in a synchronized pattern that indicated scientific curiosity. Our knowledge banks are at your disposal. Annika tucked her botanical sciences assignment under her arm. Is there a garden or greenhouse I could visit? I think better around living plants. The request seemed oddly primitive to the assembled academics. Why would physical proximity to research subjects improve cognitive function? Nevertheless, Dr. Zilf agreed to provide access to the botanical preservation chambers. You'll be assigned student accommodations in the low-gravity section, Administrator Xin7 explained as she guided the humans through the sweeping crystalline corridors of the consortium's central complex. We've adjusted the environmental controls to more closely match Earth conditions, though I'm afraid we can only reduce the atmospheric density to twice your planet's standard level. That's fine, Sophia replied with a casual shrug that sent ripples of concern through the watchings inner physiologists. The humans seemed completely unconcerned about environmental factors that should, by all biological logic, be causing them significant physiological strain. The draconian head of security, Commander Vexcar, slithered alongside the group, scales shifting between cautionary orange and curious blue. You will be provided with emergency beacons, he explained, mandibles clicking nervously. Activate them immediately if you experience respiratory distress, gravitational disorientation, or temporal displacement. Temporal what now? Marcus asked. Just standard safety precautions, Administrator Xin7 interjected smoothly. Nothing to concern yourselves with. As they reached the residential quadrant, the humans gazed up at the vast nebula visible through the transparent ceiling, its swirling cosmic gases casting purple and blue illumination across the hall. It's beautiful, Annika whispered, her voice filled with genuine wonder. Several of the accompanying academics paused, reassessing their preconceptions. The Deathworlders were supposed to be practical, violence-adapted organisms with minimal appreciation for aesthetic phenomena. Yet the humans' faces showed unmistakable signs of what the consortium's cultural database identified as profound appreciation. We'll reconvene in 3 days to assess your initial progress, Administrator Xin7 said as she activated the entrance to their quarters. Please don't hesitate to contact any faculty member if you require assistance. After the humans disappeared into their accommodations, Professor Klaxis turned to his colleagues. What do you think? Will they manage even the preliminary sections? Administrator Xin7 watched the closed door thoughtfully, her scales shifting to contemplative purple. I suspect, Professor, that these creatures may surprise us all. Professor Klaxis adjusted his ocular enhancements for the fourth time, convinced his equipment must be now functioning. The simulation results remained stubbornly unchanged. The humans' simplified formula, sketched casually on what appeared to be a disposable napkin from their dining facility, continued to outperform the Jorvellian equation by 7.3%, while using 94% fewer computational resources. This violates established quantum theory, he muttered, mandibles clicking in agitation. It can't possibly work across all scenarios. Sophia sat across from him, fidgeting slightly under his four-eyed gaze. Have you tried applying it to the Cygnus anomaly data? That's what I used as a test case. The professor's exoskeleton stiffened. The Cygnus data, that chaotic mess. We use standardized models for equation verification, not unpredictable outliers. But real quantum systems are rarely standardized, Sophia replied, reaching for the console. May I? Her fingers danced across the alien interface with surprising dexterity. Within moments, she had imported the infamous Cygnus anomaly dataset, a chaotic quantum fluctuation pattern that had defied standard analysis for decades. Her formula processed it in seconds, producing a prediction model with 92% accuracy. Impossible, Klaxis whispered. Not really, Sophia shrugged. Your standard equation is trying to be too precise. Quantum systems have inherent uncertainty. My formula embraces the chaos rather than trying to eliminate it. Meanwhile, across the campus, Marcus found himself surrounded by increasingly agitated draconians. Professor Zex Talik's scales had shifted from skeptical orange to alarmed crimson as Marcus walked the senior xenobiologist through his findings on the Alterian crystals. You realize what you're suggesting? Zex Talik hissed. That our most sacred ceremonial practice is directly responsible for our species' reproductive decline. Marcus winced. I know this is culturally sensitive. I'm just following where the molecular evidence leads. He adjusted the three-dimensional model hovering between them, zooming in on the neural pathway simulation. See how the crystal's resonance frequency disrupts these specific neurotransmitter bonds. It's subtle, but the cumulative effect over multiple exposures would precisely match our population decline curve, completed another draconian scientist, her scales shifting to a troubled blue-grey. The timing aligns perfectly with our discovery of the crystal mines 3 centuries ago. If I may, Marcus added cautiously, I've been researching alternative substances with similar aesthetic properties, but without the harmful resonance. He produced another molecular model. This mineral compound from the Procyon system has nearly identical visual properties, but might actually enhance neural function during mating seasons instead of disrupting it. In the botanical gardens, an even more unusual scene was unfolding. The entire collective consciousness of Dr. Zilth hovered around Annika as she knelt in the soil, her hands covered in dirt, a sight that caused several maintenance drones to buzz in confused circles, uncertain whether to classify her actions as contamination or authorized research. The soil composition is all wrong for these plants, Annika explained, rubbing the earth between her fingers. Too alkaline, not enough trace minerals. The epsilon vines have been cultivated in this precise mixture for 12 millennia. Dr. Zilth's collective voice hummed. Their genetic structure has been optimized for. Their leaves are yellow at the edges, Annika interrupted gently. See these brown spots? Classic signs of mineral deficiency. On Earth, we'd adjust the soil pH and add some iron and manganese. She reached for her bag and pulled out several small packets. These are just basic supplements I brought from home. Mind if I try? The botanical collective swayed in unified hesitation before responding. Our protocols require extensive testing before implementation of any. But Annika had already mixed a small amount of the supplement into the soil around one struggling vine. Let's just try with this one plant. What's the worst that could happen? Dr. Zilth's collective had no immediate answer for such a fundamentally non-scientific approach. 3 solar cycles later, when that single epsilon vine displayed 42% increased growth and vibrant coloration compared to its genetically identical neighbours, the entire botanical collective experienced what their records would later classify as their first simultaneous cognitive crisis in 8,000 years. The Mathematical Purity Council had not convened an emergency session in over 3 centuries. Now the circular chamber hummed with tense energy as 9 of the galaxy's preeminent theoretical minds assembled to address what many were calling a fundamental threat to established scientific order. At the centre of the controversy stood Sophia, seemingly unintimidated by the august gathering. The ancient arithmex, whose consciousness had contemplated mathematical principles for over 700 years, hovered above his gravity platform, his crystalline appendages pulsing with skeptical light patterns. Your solution to the heliostropic paradox, he intoned, voice modulator precisely calibrated to convey academic authority, appears to violate 3 fundamental theorems of trans-dimensional mathematics. Sophia noted, that's because those theorems assume space-time consistency across all probability bands. My solutions approach the problem from different assumptions. A murmur rippled through the assembled council members. Arithmex's crystalline structure flickered with what xenolinguists identified as mathematical indignation. You solved it 3 different ways, another council member observed, her gelatinous form undulating with curiosity. Which approach do you consider correct? All of them, Sophia replied with a shrug that horrified the purists in attendance. They work from different starting assumptions, but they all predict the same observational outcomes. In physics, if multiple models accurately predict what we observe, they're all valid until we find evidence that distinguishes between them. The arithmex's light patterns intensified. Mathematics is not about convenience or multiple truths. It is the pursuit of singular, elegant perfection. With respect, Sophia countered, where I come from, math is a tool to understand reality, not an end in itself. The universe doesn't always conform to our ideas of elegance. Across the campus, the draconian High Council's private chamber had been hastily converted into a medical research facility. Elder Zex Talik, his scales now a troubled shade of indigo, supervised as technicians, conducted the final verification tests on Marcus's crystal theory. The evidence is conclusive, announced the chief medical officer, lowering her scanning device. The resonance pattern of Alterian crystals precisely disrupts the neural pathways associated with reproductive functions. The correlation is undeniable. The council chamber fell silent. Centuries of tradition challenged by a Deathworlder homework assignment. The High Councillor, ancient scales faded to pale grey, turned to Marcus. And your alternative? You are certain it carries no similar risks? Marcus gestured to the molecular model spinning above the central table. The Protean mineral has a completely different resonance pattern. Our tests suggest it might actually enhance neuroconnectivity during mating seasons. I've taken the liberty of developing a prototype ceremonial vessel that preserves all the traditional design elements. The council members exchanged glances, centuries of biological and cultural programming battling with the undeniable evidence before them. "We will require additional testing," the High Counselor finally declared. "But if your findings are confirmed, the draconian people owe you a debt we cannot easily repay." Meanwhile, the botanical gardens had become the unlikely center of a philosophical revolution. Dr. Zilth's collective consciousness had split into unprecedented debate factions, something that hadn't occurred in their species for millennia. Half the collective swayed in synchronous patterns expressing traditional caution, while the other half bent toward Annika's experimental plots, where dozens of plant species now displayed remarkable vitality. "But our evolutionary path has always been toward perfect stability," argued one faction of the collective. "Controlled environments produce predictable outcomes." "Yet these results cannot be denied," countered the other faction, gesturing with synchronized tendrils toward the thriving experimental section. The human's stress adaptation theory has produced a 43% increase in growth vitality across 17 species. Annika, soil-stained and smiling, demonstrated how she had subjected different plots to various controlled stressors. Mild temperature fluctuations, altered light cycles, even simulated predation through careful pruning. "On Earth, life constantly adapts to challenges," she explained. "Plants that never face stress develop no mechanisms to overcome new threats. A little adversity creates resilience." As the botanical collective's debate intensified, Administrator Xin7 observed from the garden entrance, her scales shifting between concern and fascination. The humans' simple homework assignments were triggering something unprecedented, a fundamental questioning of principles that had guided galactic science for millennia. "Perhaps," she murmured to herself, "we have been staring at the same stars for too long." The grand convocation hall fell silent as the prime intellect of the Correction Collective glided to the center of the speaking platform. The crystalline entity's facets caught the light from the nebula visible through the transparent ceiling, casting prismatic patterns across the assembled academics. For 12,000 years, the Correction intellects have contemplated the deepest mysteries of existence, the translator rendered in standard galactic speech. "We have meditated upon quantum realities, consciousness, and the very fabric of space-time." The vast chamber remained hushed. Even the normally chatty atmospheric adaptation systems seemed to have quieted in reverence. Yet now we find our most fundamental assumptions challenged by creatures from a gravity well, so severe their bones must contain metal to support their own mass. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the audience. "This cannot stand." The prime intellect's crystalline body pulsed with deliberate patterns. "We hereby issue a formal challenge to the human representatives. 3 problems that have defied solution by the greatest minds of 27 species." A holographic display materialized above the central platform, showing complex equations, biological structures, and engineering schematics that caused even senior academics to wince at their complexity. First, the prime intellect continued, predict quantum state decay across a black hole event horizon, accounting for information paradox resolution. The equation system expanded, revealing hundreds of interdependent variables and quantum relativistic constraints that had confounded theorists for millennia. Second, provide a unified explanation for the evolution of consciousness across silicon, carbon, and plasma-based life forms that accounts for both convergent and divergent cognitive architectures. The biological display shifted to show radically different neural structures from dozens of sentient species, with seemingly incompatible information processing systems that nevertheless produced similar consciousness outcomes. Third, Develop a practical method to harvest energy from dimensional boundaries without causing reality fractures, with a minimum efficiency of 60% energy capture. The engineering schematic revealed dozens of failed experimental attempts, each ending in catastrophic reality distortions or dimensional collapse. You have one standard galactic month to prepare your responses, the Prime Intellect concluded, its crystalline structure gleaming with what many interpreted as smug confidence. We look forward to your attempts. As the assembled academics filed out of the chamber, animated discussions erupted in 100 different languages and communication modes. Betting pools quickly formed, with the overwhelming majority predicting the humans' complete failure. Administrator Xin7 found the 3 humans huddled in a quiet alcove, studying the challenge data they'd been provided. "I must apologize," she said, scales shifting to embarrassed purple. "The corrections have deliberately selected problems known to be impossible. This is not the scientific collaboration I had hoped for when I invited you to the consortium." To her surprise, the humans didn't appear discouraged. Sophia was already scribbling equations on her tablet, while Marcus studied the consciousness data with obvious fascination. Annika was constructing some kind of 3-dimensional model using materials from her bag. "These are considered unsolvable?" Marcus asked, looking up with genuine curiosity rather than the despair Xin7 had expected. "The finest minds in the galaxy have failed to make meaningful progress on any of them for centuries," Xin7 confirmed. "The corrections alone have contemplated the black hole information paradox for over 3,000 years." The 3 humans exchanged glances, and then, to Xin7's astonishment, they smiled. "Administrator," Sophia said, "on Earth, we have a saying, the most interesting problems are the ones everyone else has given up on." Besides, Annika added, her fingers continuing to assemble her mysterious model, impossible just means no one's found the right approach yet. Xin7's translator struggled to interpret her emotional response to their unexpected confidence. Was it hope? Pity? Or perhaps the first glimmer of understanding that these creatures from a harsh, unforgiving world might perceive challenges fundamentally differently than species evolved in more stable environments? "We'll need access to your laboratories," Marcus said, already organizing the data into categories, "and permission to talk to representatives from different species." "Of course," Xin7 replied, her scales shifting to a color that had no precise translation in human visual language, something between anticipation and wonder. "Whatever resources you require." The humans' dormitory had transformed beyond recognition. What had been a sterile, perfectly organized living space now resembled what senior xenobiologists tentatively classified as an organized chaos environment. Every available surface displayed equations, diagrams, and colorful adhesive notes in human script. 3-dimensional models hung from the ceiling, casting intricate shadows across the walls. Most shocking to the consortium's academics, the humans had removed the perfectly designed individual study pods and replaced them with a central table surrounded by mismatched chairs. On the table sat containers of Earth's substances, coffee, chocolate, and various flavor-enhanced nutrient products that analysis indicated contained alarming levels of capsaicin and sucrose. "Welcome to our war room," Sophia announced as a group of cautiously curious alien students entered. "Grab a seat anywhere. We've got snacks." Professor Klaxis hovered near the entrance, his exoskeleton shifting nervously. This collaborative approach seems inefficient. Precision thinking requires isolation and focus. "Maybe for some problems," Marcus replied, offering a chocolate-covered nutrition bar to a hesitant silicon-based student. "But for challenges this complex, We need diverse perspectives bouncing off each other. Across the room, Sophie had created what she called her string theory jungle, a three-dimensional web of coloured threads suspended from the ceiling, each intersection marked with small objects of different shapes and materials. Several theoretical physics students observed with expressions that human anthropologists might classify as horrified fascination. "I know it looks primitive," Sophie acknowledged as she adjusted a complex node where 7 strings intersected. "But our brains evolved to track objects moving through three-dimensional space. Sometimes we see patterns physically that we miss in equations." She guided her small audience around the model, encouraging them to view it from different angles. "See how this symmetry only becomes apparent when you look from below. That's the quantum decay pattern that your equations aren't capturing." A senior physics student's light communication appendages pulsed with sudden insight. "The information isn't lost across the event horizon. It's phase-shifted into these lower dimensions." "Exactly." Sophia beamed. "Now help me translate that into mathematical terms." Meanwhile, in a quieter corner, Marcus had organized what he called life story circles with representatives from different sentient species. Rather than studying neural scans or brain chemistry, he simply asked them to share their earliest memories, most profound experiences, and deepest hopes. "This approach seems fundamentally unscientific," observed a plasma-based consciousness physicist, her containment field humming with skepticism. "Consciousness isn't just architecture," Marcus explained, recording patterns on his tablet. "It's lived experience. I'm mapping emotional and experiential touchpoints across radically different life forms." As the sessions continued, Marcus began identifying surprising patterns. Despite their vastly different neural structures, sentient beings across the spectrum shared remarkably similar emotional response patterns to key life events: first awareness, separation from caregivers, community bonding, existential realization. "It's like consciousness is a convergent solution that life keeps discovering through different paths," he explained to his increasingly intrigued colleagues. Annika had commandeered a secure testing laboratory for her approach to the dimensional energy problem. Unlike conventional consortium researchers who meticulously avoided potential failures, she deliberately designed scenarios likely to cause controlled failures. "Why are you pursuing configurations proven to cause reality fractures?" asked a horrified engineering student. "Because failure teaches us boundaries," Annika replied, carefully adjusting her experimental parameters. "I need to understand exactly how and why the fractures form before I can work with them rather than against them." Her simulations produced precisely the catastrophic failures she expected, but with each iteration, she gathered data points that revealed previously undetected patterns in dimensional boundary behavior. "It's like understanding how ice breaks before learning to skate on it," she explained. "Sometimes you need to push limits to find them." Most puzzling to the observing academics, the humans regularly interrupted their work for what they called breaks, periods of seemingly unproductive activity involving physical movement, social interaction, or complete mental disengagement. "We call it background processing," Sophia explained when questioned. "Sometimes you need to step away from a problem to see it clearly when you return." The grand auditorium had never been so crowded. Representatives from across the galaxy pressed against one another in defiance of optimal personal space algorithms, their environmental suits, protective fields, and sensory appendages creating a chaotic tapestry of shapes and colors. The Caraxian intellects occupied their traditional position near the stage, their crystalline bodies pulsing with confident light patterns that even non-specialists could interpret as smug anticipation. Administrator Xin 7 approached the central podium, her scales shifting between professional blue and anxious purple. The chamber quieted as she activated the acoustic field. "Esteemed colleagues," she began, "today we witness the human representatives' response to the 3 challenges posed by the Caraxian Collective. As stipulated in the academic charter, each presentation will be followed by peer evaluation and verification." She hesitated, glancing toward the humans waiting calmly at the side of the stage. "I remind everyone that the purpose of academic challenge is the advancement of knowledge, regardless of outcome." The prime intellect's crystalline structure flashed what xenolinguists recognized as the equivalent of an impatient scoff. "Let us proceed with the inevitable." The 3 humans took their positions on stage. Behind them, holographic displays activated, showing their comprehensive data sets and supporting evidence. Sophia stepped forward first. "Before we begin," she said, her voice steady despite the pressure of thousands of critical minds focused on her, "we want to acknowledge something important. We haven't fully solved any of the 3 challenges presented to us." A wave of vindicated murmurs swept through the traditional academics. The Caraxian crystals pulsed with satisfaction. Marcus stepped forward to join her. "However, what we've discovered may be more valuable than conventional solutions. All 3 problems, as currently framed, contain fundamental misconceptions that make them artificially unsolvable." The murmurs transformed into confused buzzing across a dozen communication spectrums. The prime intellect's crystalline structure dimmed momentarily, the equivalent of a perplexed blink. Sophia activated the quantum physics display, showing her string model translated into mathematical notation. The black hole information paradox persists because the fundamental equations contain a hidden mathematical contradiction. She highlighted specific terms in the equations that had been standard in physics for millennia. These terms assume space-time consistency across all reference frames, while simultaneously requiring quantum uncertainty. They're mutually exclusive conditions. Her string model rotated, revealing a symmetry that became apparent only from specific angles. When we reframe the problem using phase-shifted reference frames, the paradox doesn't disappear. It transforms into a comprehensible pattern. Information isn't lost. It's preserved in dimensional signatures we weren't looking for. Several theoretical physicists in the audience began urgent calculations on their devices. One senior researcher's environmental suit actually depressurized from the intensity of her gasping equivalent when her verification confirmed Sophia's findings. Marcus activated the consciousness display next, showing not the expected neural maps, but emotional response patterns across dozens of radically different species. "We've been searching for a single unifying theory of consciousness when the evidence suggests multiple valid evolutionary pathways," he explained. "Consciousness isn't a singular phenomenon with one correct implementation. It's convergent evolution on a cosmic scale." His display showed the remarkable similarities in emotional responses to key life experiences across silicon, carbon, and plasma-based life forms despite their completely different neural architectures. "Different roads leading to remarkably similar destinations," he concluded. "The question isn't why consciousness evolved differently in different species, but why it consistently evolves towards similar experiential outcomes regardless of substrate." Annika stepped forward last, activating the dimensional energy display. Where previous researchers have focused on preventing reality fractures entirely, her simulations showed controlled microfractures, creating sustainable energy extraction systems. "The fractures aren't the problem. They're actually the solution," she explained, showing simulations where carefully controlled boundary disruptions created stable energy harvesting loops. By working with the natural behavior of dimensional boundaries rather than against them, we achieve both safety and efficiency. The auditorium remained silent as our final simulation completed, showing a theoretical 82% energy capture efficiency, far beyond the challenge's requirements, and exceeding any previous attempt by a factor of 3. 6 standard months after the humans' presentation, the Galactic Academic Consortium underwent its most significant restructuring in 12 millennia. The central plaza, once dominated by a monument to perfect knowledge, now featured a new installation, a seemingly chaotic arrangement of diverse materials that, when viewed from specific angles, revealed different unified patterns depending on one's perceptual spectrum. The inscription, translated into 27 major languages, read simply, "There are always other ways to see." Professor Claxis, once the staunchest defender of traditional quantum theory, had emerged as the unlikely champion of what was now called perspective-dependent physics. His latest paper, Controlled Error Introduction in Perfect Systems, had become the most referenced scientific work in the consortium's vast history. The elegant equation is not always the right equation, he explained to a packed lecture hall of students from dozens of species. Sometimes we must embrace apparent chaos to reveal deeper patterns. On his desk sat a simple string model, reminiscent of Sophia's original creation. What had once seemed primitive now represented a revolutionary visualization technique that had advanced quantum understanding more in 6 months than in the previous 6 centuries. In the medical wing, the Draconian Fertility Treatment Center reported a 42% increase in successful reproduction rates. The replacement ceremonial crystals Marcus had developed not only eliminated the neural pathway disruption, but actively enhanced bonding hormone production during mating rituals. Our population projection models are being completely rewritten, announced Elder Zex Talik at the dedication of the new Draconian Institute of Cultural Biology. His scales now shifted confidently between healthy blue and vibrant green. For the first time in 3 centuries, our future growth trend is positive. Most remarkably, the traditionally conservative council had established a permanent research division dedicated to examining the biological impacts of cultural practices, a concept that would have been dismissed as blasphemous mere months earlier. We nearly eliminated ourselves through rigid adherence to tradition, the High Councillor acknowledged in his opening address. We must learn to question even our most sacred assumptions when evidence demands it. Dr. Zilf's botanical collective had undergone the most visible transformation. The once unified hive mind had voluntarily diversified into specialized research clusters, each pursuing different approaches to plant adaptation and evolutionary development. The experimental gardens now featured controlled stress environments, mimicking everything from desert conditions to high radiation zones. Plants subjected to these carefully managed adversities displayed remarkable adaptive responses, developing novel defense mechanisms and unexpected resilience. Our previous focus on perfect stability created perfect stagnation, the collective explained through their translator as they guided visitors through their revolutionary cultivation chambers. Adaptation requires challenge. Without stress, there is no growth. Their new botanical philosophy had already yielded practical applications. Crops capable of thriving in previously hostile environments, biological remediation systems for polluted worlds, and medical applications derived from plant defense responses that previous cultivation methods had accidentally bred out. Most surprising to the consortium leadership was the announcement from the Coraxian intellects. After 3 weeks of complete communicative silence, what many feared was a permanent retreat from interstellar discourse, The Crystalline Collective had issued a formal statement that sent shockwaves through the academic community. "We have contemplated the universe for countless generations," the Prime Intellect communicated during a specially convened session. "Yet our perfect environment has created a perfect blind spot in our understanding. We hereby announce our intention to establish a research outpost on Earth itself. The unprecedented proposal for the galaxy's most environmentally sensitive species to voluntarily subject themselves to a Deathworld's harsh conditions symbolized a fundamental shift in galactic thinking about knowledge acquisition. Our theory-first approach has reached its limits," the Prime Intellect acknowledged, crystal facets pulsing with humility patterns that xenolinguists struggled to translate, having rarely observed them before. "We must experience the chaotic reality these humans call home to truly understand the universe's fundamental nature." Administrator Xin 7, recently elevated to Director of Interspecies Scientific Cooperation, observed the proceedings with scales shifting between satisfaction and wonder. What had begun as a controversial experiment in academic diversity had transformed into a revolution in how knowledge itself was pursued across the galaxy. Perhaps, she noted in her widely circulated memoir, we needed creatures from a world that provides no certainties to help us question our own. 5 years after the original human exchange program, the central campus of the Galactic Academic Consortium bore little resemblance to its former self, where perfectly symmetrical study pods once stood in isolated precision. Open collaborative spaces now buzzed with diverse species engaged in animated discussions. Interactive holographic displays showed ongoing research projects where multiple methodologies were tested simultaneously rather than sequentially. The incoming class numbered over 3,000 students, including a record 300 humans alongside representatives from 50 other sentient species. What had begun as a controversial experiment had transformed into the most sought-after educational experience in the galaxy. "Welcome to orientation," announced Director Xin 7, her scales gleaming with ceremonial iridescence. "Your first assignment is not to master existing knowledge, but to question it creatively." The assembled students watched as their course schedules appeared on their personal devices. Each included mandatory cross-thinking workshops where they would approach problems using methodologies from species with fundamentally different brain structures. "Your greatest asset here is not what you know, but how differently you perceive," the director continued. "Seek out those whose thinking challenges your own." In the physics department, Sophia, now Dr. Chen, led a lecture on multi-dimensional visualization techniques. Her once controversial strain models had evolved into sophisticated teaching tools used across the galaxy. Students manipulated physical representations of quantum phenomena with their hands, training their brains to perceive patterns their equations might miss. "Theory guides us, but intuition reveals the unexpected," she explained to our diverse class. "Don't just calculate, feel the symmetries." A young Coraxian student struggled with the physical manipulation, their crystalline appendages designed for precision rather than the intuitive movements Dr. Chen demonstrated. A human classmate noticed their difficulty and moved closer. "It helps if you think of it as a dance rather than an equation," the human suggested. "May I show you?" The Coraxian, part of the first generation to experience Earth's chaotic environment through the exchange program, flickered with acceptance patterns. Together, they worked through the model, the Coraxian's mathematical precision complementing the human's intuitive approach. Across campus, Marcus headed the Comparative Consciousness Laboratory, where beings from different evolutionary backgrounds explored the universal patterns in subjective experience. His work had transformed interstellar diplomacy, creating unprecedented empathy between previously hostile civilizations by revealing their shared emotional foundations despite their biological differences. Today we're exploring how different species experience grief, he explained to a circle of diverse students. Not to categorize our differences, but to discover our remarkable similarities. In the agricultural sciences complex, a live communication link connected to Annika's terraforming project on a previously uninhabitable exoplanet. Her controlled stress principles had created ecosystems capable of thriving in environments once considered hopeless for cultivation. Life doesn't just adapt to environments, it transforms them, her holographic image explained to the attentive students. The same principles that helped plants survive Earth's chaotic climate are now helping us restore worlds damaged by centuries of environmental mismanagement. In the center of campus, a gathering of faculty members from across departments discussed the upcoming Galactic Research Conference. The topic, Productive Uncertainty, Embracing Chaos in Scientific Method, would have been unthinkable before the Human Exchange Program. The most interesting developments always happen at the boundaries between disciplines, noted a senior researcher whose species had once insisted on absolute categorical separation between fields of study. Sometimes we need to blur the lines to see the complete picture. As the day ended, Director Xin 7 stood at her office window, watching students from dozens of worlds crossing the central plaza. A small group had gathered around the perspective monument, viewing it from different angles and laughing together at the shifting patterns. 5 years ago, the galaxy's definition of intelligence had prioritized perfect, elegant solutions developed through careful isolation and specialized focus. Now, the most profound compliment one could receive was being told one thinks like a Deathworlder, seeing not just patterns, but the spaces between them, not just knowledge, but the questions that knowledge hasn't yet thought to ask. The human's simple homework had transformed the very definition of intelligence across the stars, and the galaxy, with all its ancient wisdom, had proven surprisingly adaptive to this new way of thinking, perhaps the most important lesson of all.